Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. So my name is Julia. I am the project administrator for NAJC. Um, so thank you everybody, and welcome to our Japanese Canadian family history session with Mandy Shintani. Thank you all for joining. Today we will be looking into how Mandy created her podcast, The Samurai in Our Closet, which is about her family history research journey. I will now hand it off to Mandy to get started.
Oh, thank you so much, Julia. So the workshop today is called From Memory to Microphone, Recording Your Family Story. First of all, before I get started, I just really want to thank the NAJC. Thank you so much to Emily Copaella, I hope I said that right, who is a researcher who helped organize this workshop, and Lori Harada, who's a project manager who suggested I give this presentation. Lori was also the script editor for our podcast called The Samurai in Our Closet. So, just to give you a brief introduction, again, my name is Mandy. I am a sensei. I'm the youngest of three daughters of George Shintani that the podcast is based on. And I grew up in a small town in Ontario called Peterborough. And like a lot of senseis, I didn't have a lot of exposure to like our family story, culture, the language, or even other Japanese Canadian families or friends. And now I currently live here in North Vancouver. So I came to Vancouver after I graduated. I am retired by background. I'm an occupational therapist and a entrepreneur of small businesses. This is the first podcast series that I've created, as I mentioned, called The Samurai Inner Closet. So, on the agenda today, I just wanted to talk about why I created the podcast. I'm hoping to give you like a brief summary of each episode and show you some clips just so you can get an idea of how I use the interviews to tell the story, and then hopefully to show you where I got the resources that I use to really give me the background history. So, for example, when I first started off, I did have an interview of my father from the Nikkei National Museum. But when I listened to the interview, I actually thought I wouldn't even be able to use it very much because I didn't really have all the historical context behind that interview. But when I started using all these different resources and understood the history of Japanese Canadians, then my father's story and his interview made so much more sense. And actually, now a lot of people have told me that his clips from the interview are some of their favorite parts. Next, I'm going to talk about how to get your relatives talking, because this is, as you know, it's really, the Nisei have really been known as the silent generation. And so a lot of times the Nisei didn't tell us the stories, and then the Sensei, I think we didn't really ask to hear the stories. So it's for many generations where there uh, people aren't used to talking about it, and so hopefully I can give you some practical tips that I use to get my both my family and my relatives talking. And I just want to mention too that for me, um, this was really the first time I had had these conversations with some of my Japanese Canadian friends, and really with my family. I hadn't really spoken to it about my children as well. So that was very, I have to say, probably one of the scariest experiences for me, or not scary, that's not the right word, but fearful, I would say, or anxiety provoking. And then I'll just give you some tips that I've used for interviewing and recording. How do you take care of yourself and others during this journey? And then how to turn your recordings into an audio story. I put or podcast. I think not many people would probably um, want to go to the extent of doing an entire podcast where you're meaning for it to go to a general audience. But anyways, I think it's basically the same guidelines in terms of you just want to hear interviews and other clips and turn it into a family audio story or a podcast. And then I believe we have the last 15 minutes where we can ask questions. So I should say too, thank you so much for joining me. I'm not sure if some of you have already heard the podcast or not. If you have, thank you very much for listening to it. And if you haven't, hopefully this will explain a little bit more about it. So, in terms of why I created the samurai in our closet, basically, when I was growing up, my father hid what would now be a 450-year-old samurai sword in our closet that he asked us to keep it as a secret. And as a kid, I didn't really know why it was there. I didn't actually know the story of their internment until I was an adult. And then as my father aged, we received bits and pieces of stories. But when he passed away at 96, which is a couple of years ago, I was 60 and I was retired. And I decided to go on a journey to put all the stories together, including when he was really a child in Japantown before the war, his internment as a teenager. Uh, I wondered why he served in the Canadian Army, even though they were labeled as enemy aliens. And that's really where he received his samurai sword in Singapore. And then I wanted to have a better understanding of why did the Nisei, why did they keep these stories a secret? Why did they rely so much on integration for us? And then I wanted to talk to other sensei and to find out what was the effect of us not knowing those stories, and then how are the future generations learning to rediscover their culture, their stories, and our family histories. So one of the things I would recommend that you do is write down all of your goals for whatever your project is. So just to give you a scope of all of my goals, I wanted, of course, to find out the full family story and the history of Japanese Canadians. I thought it would be a really therapeutic way to grieve the loss of my father, to reconnect with my relatives, especially with me being here in Vancouver. I sort of lost connection with a lot of my relatives. I thought it would be a great way to bond more with my siblings and my mother for us to all have like a joint project. Um, I was hoping because my mother's actually 94, that this might be a way to get her to start telling me some of her stories as well, even though it's very much focused on my father. I really wanted to embrace my Japanese side. I didn't really, um, I I never, it wasn't really something that I discussed a lot. I never really thought about it very much. And I really wanted to have a better understanding of even things like the culture, the language, and really how that impacted who I am as well. I wanted to build a community of Japanese Canadian friends. I wanted to unlock a lot of questions that I'd always had, like why did, a lot of, including my mom, say things like, oh, we had fun. It was for the best. My father used to say that he was lucky. I wondered, like, why did 95% of the sensei have interracial marriages? And I live close to the downtown east side, and I wondered why it's so run down. It's a very neglected part of Vancouver. Um, and finally, I wanted to understand why weren't the stories told? And the other thing I was going to say is that when you have a lot of goals, what I found is that if you're really focused on your project, and there's times where you may be disappointed that you're not getting enough interviews, or it's not moving around as much, or sometimes I would get disappointed that I wasn't sure it was going to turn out the way I wanted to, I would go back to my goals and I would say, okay, but at the same point, I've really connected with more of my cousins. It's been really enjoyable doing this with my siblings. So I really think it's a really multifaceted journey that you're going on. And it's not really just about the project. There's so many other things I think that you'll gain from it. And so, and you'll go up and down with your getting resources, etc. So I think just sort of keep all that in mind. Okay, so in terms of the storyline, basically, this is how I divided up the episodes. The first introduction is, that we don't know a lot of the stories. The second one I focused on, or episode one is one Japantown. Episode two was the internment. My father was a teenager in Sandon. And then uh, the third episode is about his time in the Canadian intelligence in Singapore. And then the last one is really on future generations. So once you've sort of got the storyline of how you want your audio story or your photo book or whatever you're trying to create, then I would suggest start looking in your closet and you'll be amazed by what you find. I hope I can give you some examples today. But just start collecting like photos and articles and artifacts, letters, and sometimes your relatives or your, family, friends, your family, they don't necessarily want to do an interview. But what I found is a lot of them will contribute in different ways. Like a lot of them sent me stories by email, or they sent me photos, they sent me articles. So um, don't be focused just on like getting the actual interviews. I think there's a lot of different ways people can contribute, and people will have different reasons for why they want to contribute in different ways. And then I made a list of people I could interview. So, of course, I wanted to start off with my own family and my children, my relatives. But I knew that a lot of them didn't have stories or maybe didn't want to share them. So I knew I had to go beyond that. So I also tried to talk with different Nisei, and then I tried to look for descendants of family, friends of my mom and dad, and veterans that went along with my father, or just Japanese Canadian veterans. And what I found too is, not to worry, you will be referred by other JCs as you go along. And then I interviewed a lot of other JCs, such as writers, historians, theater creators, and poets. So this may be well beyond what you want to go through, but I think you'd be surprised how many would be open to speaking with you. I got a lot of information from archival interviews of Nisei regarding like Japantown or Sandon and the Canadian Army through the Nikkei National Museum website and the SEDI project. So that's through the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center. So, for example, if your family is from Kaslo, you can actually do a search to find out different Nisei that actually lived in Kaslo. And then you can help that to get more background information. I did watch a lot of films and documentary plays, and I read books. Sometimes people actually sent books or they suggested I watch these. One a film that I watched was One Big Happy Family. And what I found from that documentary is that it actually gave me a lot of insight of what it was like for my children to grow up being half Japanese, which is something I didn't really have a very good understanding of what some of the challenges would be for them. So I used a lot of documentaries to not only give me a better understanding, but again, get more historical context of Japanese Canadian history. I also used landscapes of injustice to get the custodial files to find out, what kind of where my parents, grandparents lived, their ages, what they lost, and then museums. I contact National Defense to get my father's war records. And then I went to these different sites. I went to Japantown, I went to Sandon, and then one of my friends is actually from Singapore, so I asked her to visit the Changi prison where my father was working at the Canadian Intelligence Corps and where they worked on war crimes. Okay, so the first episode. I called it the introduction. I wish I hadn't. I wish I had called it episode one, because some people are, I found, actually are skipping the introduction. But really, the podcast starts with the introduction, which is called The Secret in Our Closet. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the introductory episode and just play you some clips, so that you just get an idea of how I use some of the interview clips to tell the story. And later on, I'll show you how I used it for some of the resources. So if you just bear with me, I will just exit out of here. Okay, so if you haven't listened to podcasts before, this is the introductory episode on YouTube. And I am just going to go to the first one. So, what I wanted to do was just play you a clip. It is actually of my sister. I did an interview with her about the sword. So I'm just going to move this, and just let me know if you can't hear it.
I asked my older sister, Claire Shintani, if she remembers our sword in the closet.
This is my recollection of the sword. The sword only came out, I probably only saw it maybe 6 times during my time at home. It was not brought out for like as a party trick. It was very respectful. It was a very quiet time when it was brought out. And then we would look at the hilt, and it had these beautiful little cherry blossoms that were gold. Do you remember that? No. And there was white bumpy material in between, and Dad said that was shark skin. And I liked that part. And then he would open it, right? And it would be very slow and respectful. I just like, the moment that the sheath came off, it was so scary. It was so deadly looking. I didn't really enjoy that part. I was glad it was in the closet. It was almost like a ceremony when it was brought out. And it seemed so huge, the sword, didn't it?
Mm-hmm. I didn't know why. I guess I was younger. I didn't know why we had the sword or why it was in the closet. I just remember that we weren't supposed to tell anyone about the sword.
No, it was dangerous. You could tell it was dangerous. Mm-hmm. And it was beautiful, but it was not meant to be on display.
I asked my...
So I hope you all heard were able to hear the audio on that. Please just let me know through the chat button, or you can let Julia know that who's hosting it today, that you can't hear the sound. The next clip I'm going to play is actually from my dad's interview. One of the goals that I had mentioned is that we actually wanted to find, our original intention was that we wanted to figure out what to do with my father's sword. And originally we wanted to see if we could find the original family from Japan that owned the sword, but unfortunately there was no identification tags that were on the sword, and I was told that it would be virtually impossible for us to do it. So in this particular episode, I'm just talking about the fact that in the podcast you'll learn what we actually did with my father's sword. So in this next clip, it's actually my father talking about what he would like to do with the sword.
Family and my own children about our story. Finally, You'll learn where you can view our samurai sword just as my father would have wanted.
Well, it's a real treasure as far as I'm concerned. If I find a right home for it, I will give it up.
I'm going to give the final word to my father, the most fiercely loyal Canadian I've ever known. Yet, I am now certain that he believed the story of the Japanese Canadians should serve as a cautionary tale in these uncertain times. He wrote in his journal, "Lastly, my story is a tribute to all the Japanese Canadian veterans who enlisted to prove their loyalty to Canada, so that we and future generations may live without fear from the sordid discrimination we had to endure." Thank you for listening.
Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of how I used some of the interviews that I did within my family, and a recorded interview from my dad. And also the last piece, I just left it in there because it actually comes from a journal diary that that we didn't have when I originally started the podcast, but when I started contacting the descendants of my friends of my father, actually one of them sent this journal diary to me. So that was really helpful to sort of start to reach out to people and let them know that we were trying to do this project. Okay, so in the episode one or the next episode, I really focused on Japantown. So Japantown is the downtown east side in Vancouver, where my father grew up before the war. And in order to gather more information, I actually went down to Japantown where I attended a walking tour called the Powell Street Historic Walking Tour. And it actually started at the Vancouver Japanese Language School, where my father actually went to school as well. And what was great about this tour was I actually learned so much. So, for example, for the Japanese language school, I didn't realize, but it was the only building that the Japanese Canadian community was actually able to keep because it was considered to be a non-profit society. And they actually hired a lawyer, and they actually the government tried to take it away from them because they said it wasn't really a nonprofit because they weren't holding an annual general meeting. And so even though everyone was really scattered throughout the internment, they were actually still able to collectively carry on an official annual general meeting and maintain their status. I also, they took me around to different places. One of them was the Girls' School of Practical Arts, where a lot of girls learned how to do dressmaking. And that really answered the question for me that when you see so many of the photos uh, in the internment or, the trains going up to the road camps, everyone is dressed so beautifully. And I didn't realize how much dressmaking was part of the background of what Japanese Canadian women really focused on. It also um, explained another question for me as well, is that when you go to Japantown now, it is actually very shocking. There's a lot of homeless people. The buildings are really run down. But intermittently between all these very rundown buildings, you can still see that the buildings that existed during Japantown are absolutely beautiful architecturally. You can just see that there was an immense amount of care that went into those buildings. And what you understand from what I learned from doing the walking tour is that, and I believe it was a measure to to really take down Japantown as a community, is that they actually licensed the area as an industrial area. So a lot of Japanese started moving out of Japantown because they couldn't get the permits in order to do renovations or changes to their homes or repairs. So that really explained to me why even now, because it was deemed as an industrial area, why the area is still so run down and why it is currently the way it is. I also went to areas like Steveston and the Gulf Islands. Steveston, I was really surprised. I always thought this was a European um, area, and I was shocked to find out that Steveston, actually, the majority of the residents actually were Japanese. And then I also went to the Gulf Islands, where I also thought it was a European settlement. And again, to find all the farms and the land that people were on was really surprising, and actually it really helped me to get a stronger connection to those areas as well, because I really understood that this was an area that was part of our history as well. And then here is just a photo from Strathcona Public School, where my father went. So I'm just going to show you a couple clips again from episode 1. And so if you just bear with me, I'm just going to go to the oops. Okay, so in this clip, I just need to bring you up to 18.
Talked a lot about Bachan. My grandfather.
Oh, sorry. I'm just going to explain this clip. So the other thing that I found out through the walking tour was that there was a man called Mr. Mori, and I knew from doing the hearing the interview that my father did through the Nikkei National Museum, that he mentions that his father worked for Mr. Mori. So this is just a clip, just how we found out in terms of who Mr. Mori was.
Or Jichan was a mystery. Here's my father discussing him.
His name was Mandy Shintani. And I think he tried different things. He had store, and I think he had a dry cleaner one time. But he ended up working for this Japanese club there. I think they opened up the club because what was happening was a lot of Japanese used to go to Chinatown to gamble. Of course, didn't like the idea of having the Japanese money going over to Chinatown. So they opened up this Japanese club, and of course there's gambling going on there.
With Mr. Mori.
Yeah, Mr. Mori.
You can imagine how shocked we were when we found this next video called Etsuji Mori, produced by the Nikkei National Museum. The narrator is Kai Nagata.
Of all the Japanese Canadians on Powell Street, Mori was easily the most controversial and mysterious. Here in Vancouver, he controlled a criminal empire, yet remained a close confidant of the RCMP. In fact, in 1921, he killed a man in broad daylight, yet beat the charge of murder. In the 1930s, above the Yoshino restaurant, Mori opened the Nippon Club and used that as a base to control all the gambling activity in the neighborhood. Newspapers began calling Mori the Al Capone of Powell Street.
And here's my sister Jay Shintani discussing our reflections about Jichan and Mr. Mori.
So how do you feel about having your Jichan work for a gangster?
Yeah, you know what? I've been thinking about that a lot. I think in those days you just did whatever you could to survive. They didn't have a lot of money, and he already lost the stores. What do you think about him working for a gangster?
I agree with you. Who are we to judge his decisions back there when he was trying to support his family? I'm okay with him working for a gangster.
I think we can say that
No.
grandfather did work for a gangster, so don't mess with us. So I just want to show you where I found that video. So again, at the Nikkei National Museum, on their website, they have a bunch of stories called the Nikkei stories. And if you go down here, you can see that there's tons of stories that you can find out about Powell Street. And under there, you can see I found this video called Itsuji Mori. Okay, I'm just going to bring you back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so in episode 2, it really was about the internment. And what I did to learn more was I actually went on the Tomoshibi bus tour. I think a lot of people now are learning more and more about the bus tour, but it's absolutely fantastic. I highly recommend it. It's 5 days where you go through the internment sites. You see where the road camps were, where the men were sent, and you're going along with other Japanese Canadians, so you get to hear about their stories. There were some Nisei um, that were here, so we actually firsthand heard about their experiences. I had Kim Yamada talk about her experience of being in Hastings Park and being sick with the mumps and kept in this little small dark room where they kept the children that was locked up. So, and the other thing that's really interesting as well is that a lot of the museums where the internment sites are, do have a lot of information on Japanese Canadian history. Here's just some photos of my dad as a teenager. And one of the mysteries that I had a lot was, why does it seem like in so many of the photos that there's lots of smiles and the kids seem to be having fun? And what I learned from Mary Kitagawa from her interview on the landscapes of Ingested, where they have recorded interviews, is that it really was the mothers and the Issei that really suppressed their own pain and anxiety and fear to ensure that the kids did have a childhood and provide education. Here's just a picture of Sandon now. One thing that was really interesting, you look in the background here, just below, behind this sign where it says the museum is open, is a power house for electric power building, which actually still runs and maintains the power. But when my dad lived there, he was really one of the kids that was hired as an electrician assistant, even though he was only a teenager. And they actually maintained and helped with the electricity for the internment sites in the surrounding areas. So it was really neat to go and see that. So I'm just going to, just for the last time, play you one last clip, and that is from the Landscapes of Injustice, Mary Kitagawa, just talking about her father being taken away during the internment. So if you can just hang on 1 minute, I'm just going to get to.
Enemy alien property. His name was Gavin Mowat, and ironically, my grandparents and my parents had helped Gavin, when he was growing up. He came with a doctor.
Oh, sorry, my apologies. That's an earlier one. I'm just going to need to. Oh, sorry.
Brothers, uncles, and sons as young as 18 and men as old as 60 were forcibly removed. Here is Mary Kitagawa, a Nisei who received the Order of BC for activism for Canadians of Japanese heritage, recalling the day when the RCMP officer came from her father. This is a recording from the Landscapes of Injustice website.
So on March the 17th, St. Patrick's Day, an RCMP came roaring into our property on a pickup truck. So when the RCMP came, my father lined us all up and said, "Be strong, I'll be back soon." And then as my father was getting into the truck, The RCMP officer shoved him on, and my father fell on his stomach and also hit his face. My father jumped right up to reassure us that he was fine. And he kept smiling and saying, I'm okay, I'm okay. As my father was being driven out of our property, the RCMP officer jerked the gears in the truck, and my father almost fell again. And as he was driving away, the girls, the four of us, ran after the truck, crying and waving and saying, Daddy, Daddy, come back. And as he was driven away and he disappeared into a void. But in my 7-year-old mind, as my father was being taken onto the truck, I saw the gun in the holster of the RCMP officer. I thought, because of the way he was being manhandled, I thought for sure that my father was being taken away to be shot. And it was a terrifying, terrifying time. I feel that at that time, every cell in my mother's body must have been exploding with pain. And we all ran back to her and clung to her. But she did not cry or anything. She just stayed very strong for us. And she tried to make each day as normal as possible.
So that was a very sad story from Mary Kitagawa, but just another example of how the Issei really protected their kids. So in episode 3, that was really focused on the Canadian Intelligence Corps. And for a long time, my father had told us that he was a translator. But what we found out through doing this podcast is that their initial goal for the Japanese Canadian men who were really very young. My father was only 19 the time that he joined, was they were initially trained to be spies. But as the war ended, my father went over as an interrogator working on war crimes over in Singapore. So that's where I knew that one of my friends was going back to Singapore. So I asked her to actually go to the Changi prison where they worked and for her to do some research at the museum there. Other resources that I used is that I wrote to the National Defense to get his war records. And then I used quite a few interview clips from the JCC SETI project. There were quite a few other veterans that have done recorded interviews from there. And finally, the last episode was really just looking at, why secrets were kept, how resilient the EC and EC were, and just how the next generation is really celebrating and rediscovering these stories through plays and writing plays and books and poetry. So I tried to speak to not only my own children, but also to different Yonsei that were really looking into their family history. So now I'm just going to talk to you more about some of the tips that I use to get my family and my relatives talking. The most common response, almost when I called everyone, regardless of whether they're my family, friends, but almost all the JCs, everyone always wrote to me and said, I don't have any stories. And so a lot of times people didn't want to be interviewed. And I really realized I had to use a different approach. And I think people said that for a lot of different reasons. I think a lot of people felt like it was too much pressure to be in a recorded interview. And I think most of us feel like we don't have many stories. So we're embarrassed, I think, that we don't know the stories. And oftentimes I would say to them, that's what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about the fact that we don't know the stories. So then people seem willing to talk based on that. And I think still there is a lot of fear. There's just this underlying fear that we have that if we, talk about the stories, that perhaps something will come of that. And I think a lot of JCs are also very shy. What I think is a better way to get people to talk is really to focus on it as a project rather than calling up your relatives or family friends. Let them know, first of all, you're just working on a project because I think Japanese Canadian people really are very supportive and will rally together as a community. I think they're more worried about doing something individually, but if you talk to them about could we collectively work on a project, rather than it just being about let's talk about our family stories. So I love the idea of people just saying, hey, I want to create a family tree or a photo book and stories to go along it. I call it an audio story rather than a podcast. You just want to create a display or a reunion. So I think something very non-threatening, something very concrete. And I think this really helps you to stay on focus as well, if you've actually got a set project. And of course, because we're Japanese Canadians, it has to be about the food. And I think food is an amazing connector. And one thing that my cousin Lori Harada did that I give her a lot of credit is that we actually had 2 potluck lunches. And that, I think, again, is a way to get people together to talk about the project and to start off conversations in a very non-threatening way. And then what I did was I just gave a very informal presentation about what I wanted to do on the project. And that seemed to get people asking questions. So I think slow and steady is really the way that you want to go. I think you want to set your expectation. This is going to take maybe a lot longer than you think it would. One thing that really helped is using photos. So rather than it being about like, what's your stories? We just passed photos around, or I showed photos in a PowerPoint presentation. And through the photos, people then seem to talk about more memories. And what I found is a lot of people had told me that they didn't have stories. When they saw the photos, it actually triggered certain memories and they actually had really nice stories to tell me. But the reason why I show you this story again is I'm just so, here is my aunt. She's so beautifully dressed, even though she's in an internment site. So that was, a source of conversation and the big smiles. And also, this is a group of kids that put on a show during the internment. So again, it really helped elicit discussion about all the fun things that the Issei did provide or create for the children. I found it really helpful to go to plays or watch a film together with friends or with family members or an event. And I know that I talked to Julie Tamiko Manning. She's the one that put together Tajme. And also, this is actually Yoshi Bancroft, who actually put a play together on Hastings Park, where people were first held at the barn. And both of them said that after the play, a lot of Japanese Canadians started talking for the first time. A lot of Nisei said they were surprised that people were actually interested in their stories. And particularly what was helpful is that people went as a multi-generation. So when Nisei went with Sensei and Yonsei, that really helped to facilitate conversations. Particularly, I think, too, for the Nisei, they probably feel more comfortable talking with the Yonsei versus their own children. And so that's a great way to get conversations going. Here's some pre-interview tips that I used. I found that a lot of people wanted to talk to me first before they did an interview, just to explain like what was going to be the process, what was I going to talk about. A lot of them wanted the questions before the interview because they really wanted to think about what they were going to say. Or I just told them too, it's actually a list of points that we want to cover. And I told them too that I wanted less of an interview than just a conversation, but I wanted to cover all these points. So I think sometimes people find an interview sounds really scary. And I also told people that they had the option to approve all the content so that people could feel free to talk as they wanted, knowing that later on they could come back to me and say that they didn't want certain parts of the interview recorded And that knowing that, well, in my case, doing it more as an audio story or a podcast, that they were relieved to know that I wasn't going to use their entire interview. I was just going to pick out certain stories so that there was no need for them to be able to tell me the story, very clearly and in a detailed way, because I was just going to pick up bits and pieces. I did send them guidelines on what the interview would be like how, we would conduct the interview, the amount of time it would be. And also people said they found it helpful, particularly family members, if I let them know that we were going to have multiple interviews, because sometimes they would go away from the first interview and then think of other things that they wanted to talk about. And I didn't feel as pressured for that first interview. Use a release form as well, if you because you do want to make sure that you do have people's consent if you make this into an audio story. So my pre-interview guidelines, as I mentioned, I talked about the length. Let them know that they can take breaks, because usually the interviews were about an hour long, and that there are options. They can skip certain questions that I had sent to them. They don't need to answer all of them. That I may repeat the questions that I'm asking them, because I initially people thought that was odd that I was repeating the questions, but if there's background noise, or if I think there's a way that I can get them to talk a little bit more about a certain area, I would repeat it. Do a sound check, as I found I did a couple amazing interviews, but later on when I listened to the sound, it wasn't good quality to keep it. And also record them saying their name. That was the biggest challenge that I had later on when I made it into an audiobook, is that I didn't pronounce a lot of people's names correctly. So during the interview, use your cell phone instead of a microphone, because I found when you take out a big mic, it feels very formal, and it's so easy to record interviews with your cell phone. Oops, sorry, this was repeated. Ask them if they can be in a smaller room, so free from pets, turn off the dishwashers, AC, radio, all of that creates a sound buzz in the background that really affects the clarity. So interviewing people outside of your family, use connections. Usually one, as I mentioned, will refer you to another person. And don't worry, sometimes people, I think, as I mentioned, I talk to writers and theater creators. I think you'd be surprised how many people will talk to you. So be brave. And if they don't have time, that's fine. You can send them a follow-up, because a lot of people are super busy, but just move on to other people. And just realize, yes, that many JCs in our community do want to share their stories. So here's some tips, easy tips on recording. There is actually an app on your cell phone if you have an iPhone. It's called Voice Memo, and it's really easy. Literally, if you just press on Voice Memo, you'll see a large red button that you just press to record. And then you can press another 3 buttons that says share, and it will take that recorded interview and it will either download it directly if you've got a Google Drive, or you can just email it to yourself and download it from there. I use Zoom because it actually has a recording feature that was about $20 per month. Have a area on your drive or your computer where you store all these together. We use a program called Descript, which basically took all the interviews that I did and put it into a transcript. So that way you can easily highlight the areas that you want to keep, and it's much faster than listening to the entire recording. I'm going to talk to you about some editing software, some professional editing, and also you can send your recording to the JCC SETI project. They're actually looking for digital interviews, particularly people who are Nisei or the Nikkei National Museum, if you want it digitized and put on a website. So here's just some ideas of different software that you can use. Claude Tanabe was my audio editor. I had a grant through the Japanese Canadian Legacy Society, so I used my entire grant for Claude because I'm not very IT friendly. But just that you know, there is a lot of the editing is quite easy. Here's some names that Claude gave me, and free video editing as well. I would suggest that you might want to use an editor for these things when you want to reduce background noise, improve sound quality, improve clarity, especially from the archival interviews, editing your clips for an interview, increasing the volume, or putting your clips together or adding background. I use the public libraries a lot. They actually have soundproof rooms for doing interviews, videos, recording narrations. They have all of this software programs that I talked to you about. They have classes so you can learn how to do the editing. And I use them a lot for scanning, for converting photos. So I know that doesn't exist in all libraries, but I did a quick search today, and there are quite a few libraries in Ontario that do allow for that. I'm getting near the end here. Sorry, I'm just cognizant of time. I just want to talk very quickly about how to take care of yourself and others. For others, I would say let people go at their own pace. A lot of people, you say, don't want to share the stories, as I mentioned earlier, and that's okay. And I think I talked earlier about other ways that people can share other than doing interviews. So this is more focused on yourself. I would just say that these are sad stories, so you do need to take time to grieve. I am somebody who never cried. I grew up with sort of that whole idea, I think for a lot of Japanese Canadians, that crybabies cry. But I through doing the podcast, I realized that actually crying was a really healthy way to let go of these really sad stories. And I did a lot of self-compassion. I read a lot about it and journaling about how you feel, like writing down those feelings and recognize that those feelings are completely valid for us to have. Give yourself breaks. So there were times where I'd say, oh, I'm not going to do anything, while I go on holiday or, if I felt it was too overwhelming. People wrote to me and they talked about a journal, their journey, and particularly someone on the bus tour told me that she did a lot of meditating. She went back to a Buddhist church. Forest bathing comes from Japan, but just walking the forest, yoga, really just taking time for yourself, connecting with other JCs, are going to be very supportive, but hearing about, how they felt about it. And particularly other JCs that are going through the same journey, find a few people that will support you and will cheer you on. And I also found it really helpful to go to some other JC events, like not even necessarily ones we talk about stories, but even like cooking classes, or I started taking language classes, but anything just to immerse you in the culture that makes you feel really good about embracing those. And then very quickly, I don't think a lot of people are going to do it into a podcast, or I've called it an audio story. But basically, a lot of things that I've talked about earlier, do the storyline, determine what the episodes are. And then for each episode, figure out, well, what are the resources that you're going to use? And then from there, whenever I did an interview, I would do a transcript, and I'd take the clips those interview and I would insert them into one of the episodes. So on my Google Drive, I already had them set up in different interviews, and then I just kept throwing those clips into different episodes. And then I added the narration to explain the history behind those clips and introducing the clips. And I also had a 10-person committee. You don't need a 10-person, but maybe a few people in your family that can help be part of your committee to listen to your draft episodes, give you ideas, and to support you. Thank you so much, everyone, and I wish you well on your own journey. And the whole process has been so rewarding. So I wish the same to you. And again, I'm just going to put my own email in here. It's actually Mandy, MANDY Shintani, SHINTANI @gmail.com if you think of any other questions later on. Thank you so much, everyone.